Okay, this is Mechanization in Farm Labor Part 2. As I said in my last video, my sources for this video are the fantastic 99% Invisible podcast episode on the Philistines, the Russian history textbook that I read in college, and the Ken Burns documentary on the American Civil War. Let's get into it. So in the countries and in the period of time when industrialization took place in Western Europe and in the United States, there were highly skilled laborers who worked to make consumer goods out of their homes and workshops. And these were called cottage industries. That's where that term came from. And they were things like fabric makers, weavers, dyers, people who would make pottery, people who were silversmiths, people who would make iron goods, blacksmiths, gunsmiths. Every consumer good that you can think of had to be made by somebody by hand in their house. And these folks were a professional class. They were relatively well paid. If they were skilled, they would be prosperous. And there were guilds that they used, professional guilds, to sort of standardize their skill sets and also to sort of hold those secrets close so that not everyone could get in on their industry, so they could keep the profits for themselves. But in general, these were highly skilled laborers who were able to make very good money working from their homes in these cottage industries. And there was a point at which some savvy / cleverly evil business people realized that if they could come up with machines that could make these consumer goods, they could make them more cheaply, they could make them at a level of quality that was comparable, and they could essentially take this industry out of the hands of the cottage workforce and take those profits for themselves. And those industrialists worked to make these machines that would make rifles and would make teapots and would make cotton fabric and would be able to dye cotton fabric on an industrial scale. And so they could make these items more quickly, and they could use laborers. I don't know about fewer laborers, but maybe a class of laborer that was less skilled. So you could essentially train someone on how to use this machine in a pretty short period of time, say a couple of weeks at the most. You could train someone how to use this machine, as opposed to the years and years of apprenticeship that it would take for you to become a silversmith or a potter or a weaver in the old system. So the mill owners started these mills, they started these factories, and they brought in laborers from the farms to come and work in conditions that were unsafe, in hours that were extremely long, and for wages that were very low. And the people who worked in the cottage industries were not happy, and they staged protests where they went and under the cover of night they would destroy these machines, specifically the weaving machines. The weavers were really, really not happy about this because their livelihood was being taken away. Now, in general, I'm fairly pro-technology. I think that the fact that we have woven cotton fabric that is high quality and easy to produce and can be quickly and easily made by machines is generally great. But whenever there are these technological advances, there tends to be a transfer of wealth from one group to another. And in this case, it was a group of sort of middle-class folks who had spent their lives at a craft, and it was transferred to some factory owners who were exploiting the workers and making insane amounts of money. So to bring it back to farming, which is where we started, the same pressures that exist in other industries exist in farming, except that in farming, the margins are very, very thin. And as I've said in my previous videos, it's a capricious and difficult industry. If you have a factory, yes, every now and then there might be a natural disaster that'll keep you from being able to run that factory. Like you're going to have some problem. The windows might get blown in. You might lose your power source. You might have some issues, yada, yada, yada. But you aren't subject to the same weather and pest and disease issues that you have as a farmer. Like it's a difficult industry. So those same pressures exist to make the farm as efficient as possible, but there's always a balance with farming between it doesn't make enough economic sense to purchase this expensive farm equipment. Farm equipment is very, very expensive. It's really specialized. It's highly technical equipment. The harvester that you use for one crop isn't necessarily going to work for another crop. And it's only going to work in very specific ways. So you have to sort of design your whole farm, design your whole planting schedule around the types of machines that you are using. And it might, in the modern era, also look like you decide to purchase a type of seed that is designed to be made with a certain pesticide, to be used with a certain pesticide. So you have to purchase all those things from the company that sells them, and it's very expensive. And you have to design your whole farm around this, your whole planting schedule around this. So you might decide as a farmer that it makes sense for you to pay people to harvest your crops for just those 2 or 3 weeks when you have to harvest, or that month that you're harvesting. It might make sense for you to pay people instead of investing in this farm equipment that is going to take a lot of capital up front, and it might make you a little bit less flexible in the future because maybe you need to change the crop that you're growing. And then you have a piece of equipment that's specialized to the last crop, and then you have to sell it. But are you going to be able to sell it for anything near what you got it for? Maybe, maybe not. There's just a lot going on there. And so this commenter who spurned me to make this video was sort of saying, like, obviously we use equipment, we use machines on the farm, which of course, obviously in the modern era. But depending on the crop and depending on the farm, it varies a lot as to how much machinery you're using. And in looking at the history of farming in the United States, it was these times when there were labor shortages and when farm labor got expensive that spurned these technological advances. For example, in the 1920s, there were laws that essentially restricted U.S. immigration to white European only were the laws of the land in the 1920s during this time of isolationism. And during that time, farm labor got more expensive because a lot of the folks who were working on our farms were immigrants from China, Japan, the Philippines, and Mexico. And so a lot of farm labor in this time period was mechanized. It made sense at that point, once farm labor got expensive enough, for farmers to buy this equipment. And also it was a time of a bit of a farming bubble, which I have addressed in one of my earlier videos. And so it made sense, but then it also made farming more expensive, and it meant that you had to take these loans out, and sometimes it wouldn't make sense. Your crop would fail 1 year, 2 years, then you couldn't pay those loans back and you lose your farm. So these leaps in mechanization also happened in the 1960s after the Bracero program ended and farm labor started to unionize. Farm labor got more expensive, and so then some of the farms decided to mechanize where they could. And that will likely happen again as we are rounding up immigrants who are here without papers. It may be that some of the farmers will decide to mechanize, but in the meantime, there will be some shortages. Like, that's just, these things don't happen overnight.